Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Longtime Watershed Council's June webcast. I'm Clinton Begley, Executive Director for the Council. To begin, I wanted to first acknowledge that the Longtime Watershed lies within the traditional homelands of the tribes and bands of the Kalapuyan peoples. Following treaties in the 1850s, the Kalapuya were dispossessed of and forcibly removed from their indigenous homeland by the United States government. Today, many descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. We acknowledge that we are in occupied lands and express our respect for the Kalapuya and all tribal nations of Oregon and the important contributions they continue to make to their communities, including to the stewardship of this watershed. I'm going to turn it over to Rob Hoshaw, our Operations Director, who will take it from here.
Thanks, Clinton, and welcome everybody, and thank you all for tuning in wherever you may be. So I'm Rob Hoshaw, the Operations Director for the Longtime Watershed Council. And tonight we're excited to welcome Troy Tate. He's a board member with Oregon Black Pioneers, and he'll be presenting to talk about Black history in the state of Oregon, including sharing some specific history to the Eugene area of our watershed. He'll also talk about the mission and purpose of the Oregon Black Pioneers organization, which is the only historical society in the state dedicated to preserving and presenting the history and heritage of Black Oregonians. So you might have noticed that the council is focusing more on race these days. It's been something that we've been focusing on more in our public meetings and in our newsletters. And you might be wondering, how does this topic of race connect to our mission and work? Well, the answer to that is actually pretty straightforward. If you look at our mission statement, one of the core tenets is that we rely on the collaboration of all interests and the collective wisdom of our community. And the reality is we haven't always done such a good job of including all interests. And honestly, there have been some critical perspectives that we've largely left absent from watershed conversations over the years. It's something that we, along with many of our partner organizations in the conservation community, are trying to change. And why are we doing that? One, because it's the right thing to do. And secondly, we won't achieve our goals for a healthier watershed without the collective wisdom and lived experiences of diverse voices. As we heard from Haley Case Scott in March during her presentation on the intersection of racial justice and climate change, we saw that data has shown us repeatedly that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately impacted by the negative experiences of environmental issues. And yet they are also excluded the most from environmental decision-making. The council's work stands to really be strengthened considerably by leadership from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and how we talk about and how we act upon the environmental challenges that we all face. So Troy's presentation tonight will be divided into 3 sections, and there will be an opportunity for you as viewers to ask questions after each. This is being streamed live over YouTube, and we encourage you to type your questions into the chat box directly in YouTube. We'll curate and collect those questions, and then I'll ask those of Troy in between each section. So now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Troy, who, as I mentioned, is a board member with Oregon Black Pioneers. He joined the organization in 2018, and he is also the owner, operator, and founder of the Sunshine Center Preschool in North Portland, and he's the associate pastor of Christ Memorial Church. Troy is a husband and father of 2 young children. He enjoys making positive impacts in the community and has a passion for new adventures and experiences. He's excited to have opportunities to inform the public about Black success in this region, as they have been a part of the fabric of this region since Lewis and Clark arrived on the Oregon Trail. So welcome, Troy. We're really excited to have you, and feel free to take it away. Oh, still on mute, Troy.
There we go. Okay. Thank you guys so much, Rob and Clinton and the Tom Long Watershed Council, for giving me this opportunity to make this presentation today. So a couple of things. I'll just go off script for just a second, just to kind of reiterate and highlight a few of the things that Rob mentioned in the introduction. First of all, as a member of the Oregon Black Pioneers, our role and responsibility is to not only maintain, discover, and try to disseminate information about the contributions of African Americans in the state and territory of Oregon. My presentation that I'll make today will include some information prior to the state, Oregon becoming a state when it was just a territory, as well as some information surrounding its inclusion into the Union, and a little bit of history from about 1849 until about 1940. And then I'll make some conversation about some things specific to the Eugene area and Lane County specifically. But our role and responsibility as the Oregon Black Pioneers is to try to maintain that history and disseminate information about the individuals, the pioneers as we describe them, who are a part of the fabric of this state. And I also kind of want to make the point that the history of African Americans in the state of Oregon isn't solely African Americans' history, but rather Oregonian history. And it's just as important to talk about the contributions of African Americans in this state as it is to talk about any other Oregonian. And so I want to try to make this as inclusive as possible to suggest that this isn't just a history that's specific to me and those that look like me, but it's history that should be known by everybody who is a native Oregonian, or even those that are transplanted here now, as many people are. And so I'm going to start off our presentation with that kind of introduction. So give me just a moment here as I pull up my screen and get us going. Okay, so we'll be discussing some of Oregon's earliest Black pioneers. The story of Blacks in Oregon is a difficult one. At the time of Western immigration into that new frontier, Blacks were still dealing with a life of slavery in the South and disenfranchisement in the North. The West offered new opportunities for whites, but uncertainty faced Blacks who were brought West as property. A Peculiar Paradise, a history of Blacks in Oregon from 1788 to 1940, written by Elizabeth McLagan, describes Oregon for Blacks in this way. A peculiar paradise is an apt description for early African-American experiences in the state. From the beginning of white settlement, there was ample and open hostility towards Blacks, but compared to the horrific conditions slaves were enduring in the South, Oregon was indeed a relative paradise. Virtually all of the stories we'll discuss today will outline in some way the hostility, resentment, and dislikes for Blacks in the region. However, the Blacks who made it here showed the resilience, class, and tenacity to be successful in a new world. In addition to the racism, the West still needed to be tamed, and the Blacks that led their way in these spaces, professions, and in the community commitment in a way that all of us should find inspirational. Having a little technical difficulty here. Here we go. A few things that we want to be sure to understand when talking about historical places, times, and people is that the language, customs, and culture is entirely different from what it is now. We have to place proper context around the lives, behavior, and character of the people at that time. So there may be interchangeable language, such as the use of the word Negro, colored, or even describing people as property. The people of this time navigated life as best they could, as it was at that time. Many of these people were not only pioneers in coming to the Western frontier, but also in challenging laws, creating new customs, and creating new lenses for us to live and benefit from now. These stories, although hard to hear or imagine, show great strength, perseverance, and diligence. It may be uneasy to hear how laws were created to create barriers for Blacks at the time, but these stories demonstrate the tenacity of those who will not be deterred despite the laws, rules, and customs. One of the first individuals that I'll talk briefly about is Marcus Lopez. Black history in Oregon, the Black history on the Oregon coast begins with bloodshed. The first known person of African descent to set foot in the Oregon coast soil was Marcus Lopez of West Africa's Cape Verde Islands, who accompanied Captain Robert Gray as a servant on his journey by sloop in 1788. According to the ship's log, Gray ordered the Lady Washington into what we refer to these days as Tillamook Bay. The Tillamook Indians greeted and crew warmly, offering food and even dancing for them. Later, however, Lopez discovered his cutlass was missing. According to the ship's log, he confronted the local Native Americans and a scuffle ensued. Lopez was stabbed and abandoned by Gray and company, who killed at least one of the Tillamook Indians before fleeing to their ship and setting sail. Gray named the bay's harbor Murderer's Harbor to commemorate the grim occasion. The second person that I'll discuss was Yorick, who was Clark's slave and assistant on the Oregon Trail. Yorick was William Clark's slave and an integral member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, sent by President Thomas Jefferson to explore the Louisiana Territory and the Oregon country in 1804 through 1806. The written description of Yorick portrays him as a large, dark, strong, and agile. His date of birth is unknown, but his parents were owned by William Clark's father. And as a young child, Yorick was assigned as a companion and later manservant to Clark. In the tradition of Southern slavery, that usually meant that they were both about the same age, which means that Yorick was probably born about 1770. Journal entries and oral traditions note that Native people were impressed by Yorick, that his presence operated as a valuable element in the expedition's diplomatic interactions with those they encountered. On October 9th, 1804, expedition member Sergeant John Ordway recorded in his journal, "The greatest curiosity of them was Yorick, Captain Clark's black man. All the nation made a great deal of him in reference to his dark skin that the Native Americans had never seen. Yorick's contributions also included hunting, medical services, and physical labor, and participation in special exploratory activities. During the difficult days of the return trip, when the expedition members were near starvation, Yorick was entrusted with the critical task of trading their few remaining valuables with the natives for desperately needed provisions, ensuring the expedition's survival. Clark eventually granted Yorick his freedom in about 1816, approximately 10 years after the expedition's return to St. Louis, Missouri. Yorick's final fate is clouded in mystery. One version, offered by Clark, claims that Yorick grew to hate his freedom and died in Tennessee while trying to return to his old master. Another version, based on a description by an 1830s mountain man named Zenas Leonard, has Yorick living out an honored life as a Crow Indian chief in the West. There is no conclusive evidence to support either of their claims. Our next section is going to cover traveling the Oregon Trail, but I want to pause right here just to see if there's any questions before we get into our next segment.
Hey, Troy, am I back on?
Yes.
Yeah, it looks like we had a little bit of a flub, and the comments are turned off with YouTube, some sort of new YouTube setting, I think, that we forgot to turn on. So if folks want to send in questions via email, would that be something that we could post on our website afterwards?
We could, and then I could try to answer them post our presentation today.
Yeah.
I'd be willing to make some time to try to address any questions that people have about the presentation.
Okay, well, we can figure that out. And so you can send any questions to info@longtom.org. In the meantime, one thing that I've been curious about how Oregon Black Pioneers collects all this information. Like, this just seems like such a huge endeavor, piecing together the puzzles of where people came from, when they came over, who their family members were, when they got married, what their occupation was, how long did they stay in Oregon? Like, what has that been like to piece all that kind of information together? And have you had to look at many different sources to get information on one individual?
Yes, so great question. One thing that I've learned, as I still consider myself a newer board member, even though it's been almost 3 years since I've joined the organization, is that the relationships that we have with other historical societies. So there's the Oregon Historical Society, or the Southern Oregon Historical Society, or all of these areas and groups that are responsible for kind of handling historical information as it pertains to their region or their area or a grouping of people. And so the Oregon Black Pioneers has been around for a little under 30 years. And in that time, we've built a lot of relationships with historical societies in order to share information and then do a lot of research. We also have relationships with local universities. So Oregon State, University of Oregon, Portland State University. We share a lot of resources and information that pertains to our mission of upholding and disseminating information about Blacks in the state of Oregon. And so through relationships with historical societies or universities, we kind of cobble together a lot of these stories, pictures, information, and then just do a lot of research in various academic resources, if I can get it out. So for me, in preparation for finding information that was specific to Lane County and Eugene, I still have access to a lot of university libraries. And so I have to hop on EBSCO and places like that to find articles in newspapers. So I have some articles from the Registered Guard that we'll use. I can start off on Google and that'll maybe give me a little information, but because we're a historical kind of organization, I have to then try to find peer-reviewed information to try to find some level of accuracy about the information that I'm going to disseminate, because we want to get out right information. And so there is a lot of research that we will use in order to make sure that the information that we're giving to the public is as accurate as it can possibly be.
Mm-hmm. And is Oregon Black Pioneers able to have ownership or get ownership of some of these historical documents and photographs, or do they all end up having to go back to the university and historical societies?
Yes, so there are some things that we own outright. So I made reference to a book earlier, Peculiar Paradise, which we have been giving the copyright or publishing rights to so that we can start republishing that book. And so there are some things that we share because of our working relationship, specifically like with the Oregon Historical Society. And so they have a lot of photos that they allow us access to. And some of those photos I'll be using in the next piece specifically as we talk about traveling the Oregon Trail. A lot of the photos and information I was able to gather through the Oregon Historical Society. But some things that we find either on our own or that are very specific to the mission and work that we do, some organizations will give it to us or kind of provide us unlimited access to its use so that we can continue to disseminate that information.
Good, good. Yeah, I was curious about that. Yeah, sorry again about the comment section being down. Clinton and I will do our best to try and channel thoughts of our peers and fellow community members and come up with questions as we go.
Okay, sounds good. And I'll try to, dive a little deeper into some of the things that I'll kind of discuss in order to provide additional information as well. Okay, so if you don't have any more questions, I will just jump into our next section, which talks specifically about traveling the Oregon Trail. Now, I am a native Oregonian, and I know I played the Oregon Trail game growing up in Portland Public Schools here. And often when we think about the early travelers of the Oregon Trail, we have in our minds white individuals, but on the Oregon Trail, as well as white individuals, there were Black individuals. Some of them, as we'll find out during this section of the presentation, came along as sojourner individuals who were promised their freedom. Some of them came along as slaves who earned their freedom once they got to the new Oregon Territory. But nevertheless, there were Blacks traveling along the Oregon Trail. So as we begin to look more specifically at the Negroes traveling west in the new frontier, they were traveling into a new place that was welcoming to new arrivals, but not to the Negro. Prior to Oregon becoming a state, laws preventing Negroes from settling into the region, there was economic anxiety as well as racist overtones to their exclusion. First, white immigrants did not want to have to compete with cheap slave labor. Coming from areas where these poor whites had to compete with free slave labor was not something they wanted to compete with in the New West. In addition, it was also believed that free and enslaved Negroes would join with Native Indians of the area, and the combined forces could attack, kill, or overthrow the migrating settlers. These two thoughts, combined with the overall prejudice against Blacks, led to to the amendments excluding Blacks from the Oregon Territory. These laws were included in the first constitution of the state, which was submitted with the state's acceptance into the Union. What you see here are scanned images of the original Oregon Constitution outlining the exclusion of Black residents. This was a part of the Oregon State Charter, as well as its ratification of a state when they proposed to become a part of the Union. So Oregon is the only state with these type of laws on its books. Laws specifically excluding Blacks from being residents in the state, or at that time, the territory, but also the state of Oregon. Oregon is the only state to be given statehood with these types of laws on the record. They were not officially repealed until 1926. This meant that all Negroes entering Oregon could not be enslaved. However, they could not have legal residence and were given up to 3 years to leave with threat of whippings every 6 months if they did not vacate. There is only one case of someone actually being excluded based on these exclusion laws. Jacob Vanderpool was arrested in August 20th, 1851, and within a week he was tried and convicted of breaking the 1849 exclusion law. The reality is that this was a way to eliminate competitive Negro businesses, as Mr. Vanderpool owned a saloon, restaurant, and boarding house in Oregon City. There are other examples of whites trying to exclude Blacks based on the exclusion laws, but these cases either were unsuccessful or the Negroes left before the hearing. One of the families is Abner Francis, who they tried to exclude. He petitioned his friends and got over 200 signatures to prevent his exclusion. He also shared letters with the prominent abolitionist Frederick Douglass and was instrumental in helping to bring attention to the treatment of the Negroes in the West. So any Black individual who wanted to settle in the territory or state of Oregon first had to deal with exclusion and the fact that they did not want, the settlers did not want Blacks in the area. Despite that fact, many Blacks made the 2,000-mile journey to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Overcoming racism meant challenging those who uphold their desires to pursue their life, liberty, and happiness. In some of our next stories, we'll talk specifically about some of these individuals. This is just a map here showing what the Oregon Trail looked like. Maybe you've seen it before, or maybe you haven't, but this is a considerable journey that individuals took by foot and on covered wagons. As I mentioned just a moment ago, it was about 2,000 miles. So not only was the travel grueling, but when you arrived in Oregon, you didn't necessarily receive a warm welcome, but that did not stop many African Americans from seeking their life, liberty, and pursuits in the new Western frontier. The first individual that I'll discuss is a fellow named George Washington. George Washington was one of the early Black settlers in the Pacific Northwest who overcame prejudice and discrimination in order to play a crucial role in settling the Washington Territory. Washington was born in Virginia in 1817. Soon after his birth, his father, a slave, was sold, and his mother left him with a white couple named James and Ann Cochran, who raised him. As a small boy, he lived in Ohio and Missouri. While living in Missouri, the Cochrans petitioned the state of Georgia on Georgia's behalf, and he was given full rights as a citizen, except for the right to vote. In 1850, George and the Cochrans moved to the Oregon Territory. They first settled in Oregon City, but because of the laws prohibiting Blacks from settling in Oregon and owning land, they decided to cross the Columbia River to the northern Oregon Territory. The Cochrans purchased land under their name near the confluence of the Chehalis and Skookumchuck rivers. A petition was mounted by the citizens in the area to allow George Washington to remain in the territory. When the Washington Territory was created in 1853, the new territory statutes did not prohibit Blacks from owning land. George purchased the Cochrans' land and additional property, which he both farmed and logged. In the early 1870s, the Northern Pacific Railroad was built through his land. At some point, George married a local widow, named Mary Jane Coons. He was a prominent member of the community and founded the town of Centerville in 1875. The name was changed to Centralia in 1883. George Washington died in 1905 at the age of 88 and is remembered as a leading African-American pioneer in the Pacific Northwest. This suggests that George traveled the Oregon Trail, arrived in Oregon City, but because of the exclusion laws, then moved into what we would now describe as the state of Washington and helped found the city of Centralia, Washington. The next person that I'll discuss is Rose Jackson. Rose came to Oregon in 1849 as a slave of Dr. William Allen. According to family lore, Allen knew about the exclusion laws and decided not to bring Rose with him. However, Rose convinced the family to take her and traveled in a wooden box with ventilation holes in order to not be seen. Rose was freed when they got to Oregon, but Dr. Allen died soon after they arrived. She is credited with helping the family survive the first winter by working as a laundress to bring in money. This is a photo of Rose and her young son. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find out what his name was, but this is a picture of her and her son after they gained their freedom from helping the Cochran family. This next story that I'm going to discuss is a very peculiar story, and it helps to set precedent about abolishing slavery in the state of Oregon. So Robin and Polly Holmes are the parents of the lady in this photo. The lady in this photo is named Mary Jane Holmes Shipley. We're unable to find photos of her parents, but she is the lone survivor of this kind of family story that I'm about to share with you right now. In 1854, Polk County assessment rolls show the value of Robin Holmes' personal and total property. Robin and Polly Holmes arrived in Oregon in 1844 as the property of Nathaniel Ford. In their mid-30s at the time, they brought with them 3 of their 6 children. Their other 3 children were sold off as slaves in Missouri prior to them leaving. Before leaving Missouri, however, Ford promised Holmes' family their freedom upon arrival if they would help him establish a farm in the Oregon Territory. Settling in the Willamette Valley near Rickreall, Ford built a small cabin for the Holmes, but denied the family its promised freedom. In 1850, Robin and Polly then had 5 children, and Ford granted them and their infant freedom, but kept their other 4 children as slaves. Harriet, one of the children still held by Ford, died in 1851. Recognizing that Ford would not willingly free his surviving children, Robin began an unprecedented legal battle to get custody of his children. Robin was up against formidable odds. He had lived his life as a slave, raised in slave culture, was bought and sold, and was illiterate. He was bringing suit to an influential man with powerful connections who was recently elected to the territorial legislature. So just so you understand the context of this story, the Fords brought the Holmes to the Oregon Territory after promising the Holmes that they would be given their freedom once they arrived in the Oregon Territory. However, once they arrived, they only provided freedom to the parents and their youngest child, keeping 4 of their children in slavery. One of their children died, and the father, Robin Holmes, decided that he was going to try legal precedent to get his children free through a lawsuit. However, he was facing insurmountable, very difficult odds. I shouldn't say insurmountable because, as you'll find out in a moment, he was able to win the case. But he was a slave who grew up in slave culture and was illiterate. So that in of itself meant that it was very difficult for him to try to bring a suit against his former slave owner. Not only that, but the former slave owner had been elected to the Oregon Territorial Legislature. So that would mean that he was a politician. So in addition to all the barriers of this slave individual who was illiterate trying to bring suit against a white man, that white man also happened to be a very prominent politician. Reuben Boise acted as Holmes' attorney. Boise later served as a delegate to the Oregon Constitutional Convention in 1857. In 1852, as Robin's attorney, Mr. Boyes mounted a credible case against Ford. He filed a writ of habeas corpus in 2nd District Court in Polk County, seeking the return of Holmes's unlawfully detained children. The intent of the writ was to require Ford to bring the children to court and explain under what authority he was holding them. If Ford failed to satisfy the court, he would likely be ordered to return the children to Holmes, or so Holmes hoped. According to the initial brief court record, Ford admitted that he detained the children. The case worked its way through lower courts and finally reached the bench of Chief Justice George A. Williams of the Oregon Territory Supreme Court 15 months later. Williams ruled against Ford, declaring that slavery could not exist in Oregon without special legislation to protect it. He then declared the Holmes children free. Following the ruling, and with their rights to their children restored, Reuben and Polly Holmes moved to Marion County, where they operated a successful plant and nursery. So that case, the Holmes-Ford case, helped to set precedent barring slavery in the state of Oregon. As I mentioned in the introduction, the state of Oregon had exclusion laws preventing slavery, but also preventing Blacks from having residency. However, there was no real legal precedent suggesting that Blacks could not be owned as slaves within the state. This case set the precedent, the legal precedent needed for there to be no slavery in the state of Oregon. This next story that I'll discuss is the Cora Cox story. Originally born in Virginia, Cora Ann Cox was purchased in New Orleans in 1837 by Emmeline Carey, who married Samuel Johnson in 1850 in Missouri. They then immigrated to Oregon that same year, probably taking Cox with them. In 1852, the Johnsons were issued about 640 acres of Brownsville land in the donation land claim. In the 1860 land count and census, she is listed as a Black slave under the Jefferson and Emmeline Huff household at age 32. At some point after 1852, Samuel died, and in 1859, Emmeline was remarried to Jefferson Huff. Emmeline then turned over 36.3 acres of Johnson's land to Cox for faithful services rendered in 1864. This is most likely the time after which the house was built. Jefferson Huff had his own slave named John from Tennessee. When Jefferson married Emmeline, this caused John and Cora to live together, and together they gave birth to two girls, Adaline and Angeline Cox. Neither of the children lived to the age of 7, however, and John died in 1875. Cora lived until 1891. During her time in her first house, she was a participant in many community events and left a monetary donation to Willamette University Women's College in their will. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Cora Cox also donated her property to the Willamette University. And the Cora Cox home is still standing today and has been listed as a historical landmark there in Linn-Benton County. And there's still recognition of the contribution that she made by donating that land to the university. The last person that I'll discuss as it pertains to the Western frontier and the Oregon Trail is Moses Harris, who was a guide, explorer, and trapper. Moses Harris is one of the best known African Americans ever to travel to the Oregon Territory and one of the first. Also known as Black Harris or the Black Squire, he is said to have been born around 1800. Exactly where is unclear. The importance of Harris to the era's history is underscored in an article titled Black Harris and the Oregon Trail. In it, Thomas James Martin writes, Moses Harris was one of the foremost and earliest Western explorers and wagon train guides, a true free spirit who deserves more recognition for the part played in settling the West. By the 1840s, the fur trade had dwindled, so Harris began working as a guide for missionaries and settlers. At least 3 immigrating parties that we know of arrived under his guidance. The Whitman Spalding Party in 1836, and a large wagon train in 1844 that included the Bush, Holmes, and Ford parties. His skills were such that he effected at least 2 rescues. As you can see, well, you may be able to see in the photo to the left, there are some additional trails that Moses Harris is responsible for creating. One of his rescues described how some of the settlers traveling the Oregon Trail went up a pass that was not passable during the winter months. And Moses Harris successfully traveled up that pass to help retrieve that wagon train and led them on a different path that ultimately led them into the Willamette Valley. He was successful in navigating what's called the Applegate Trail, which is the trail that he founded himself because that pass during the winter was unpassable. As you can see from this map here, after Blacks landed in Oregon, after traveling the Oregon Trail, there's almost no corner of the state that they did not ultimately settle in, despite the exclusion laws, and despite the beliefs that they would not contribute anything valuable, or that they would probably link up with the local Native Americans of that era and try to overthrow the white settlers. None of that remained to be true. There might be some instances of stories where some Blacks and some Native Americans gathered together, but the vast majority of those individuals who traveled the trail or ultimately landed in the state or territory of Oregon went on to make significant contributions to the local communities, cities, and resulting places wherever they landed. Again, as you can see, they touch kind of all 4 corners of the state. So I'm going to kind of pause right here before we enter in our final portion.
I love that map of Oregon you just showed, Troy, that showed African Americans all across all corners of Oregon. That's really, really cool to see. And it shows, like you were saying, their impacts on all parts of the state, and not just, the Willamette Valley or Portland, or all over. I'll add that our comment section seems to have come back. So if folks have comments, feel free to type them in. Clinton is watching over that and is ready to send those over to me. Something that we are curious about is, what do you think is the lasting legacy of those exclusion laws in Oregon, and are they still playing a role in the Black experience here in Oregon today?
Yes. So what we'll discuss a little bit is that although the exclusion laws were ultimately kind of eradicated, the sentiment still kind of remained. And so as Blacks began to arrive, more in the early 1900s, as the trains began to bring more people, so you no longer had to travel the Oregon Trail in order to come to the Oregon Territory, but the use of the locomotives were able to bring much more people to the territory. And as they began to arrive, there were other barriers kind of put in place. So although the exclusion laws were repealed, laws preventing the renting of homes or the buying of property still made residency difficult in the state. There were laws prohibiting hiring of Blacks outside of kind of menial labor jobs. And so although many Blacks would work on the freight trains as Pullman porters or some sort of domestic role and responsibility, they really couldn't pursue a lot of professional opportunities. And so that meant that the jobs that were available were very limited in what it was they could do. And then, oh, by the way, you can't own any land, and there's very limited spaces in which you can rent. And so that just really diminished the number of people who came here and ultimately settled and thrived. And then there's just a lot of kind of resulting stories that happened, one of which that I'm going to discuss when I get to our Lane County and Eugene story is one that is very often told as it pertains to the expansion of the cities or communities. Oftentimes, wherever Black folks ultimately settled somehow or another, something would come along to disrupt that. This is unrelated to Oregon, but there was a lot of conversation over the last couple of weeks about the Tulsa massacre, and how individuals in Tulsa made a nice living for themselves in the Black community, and whites came over and burned the city down. And so you have stories like that, even in the state of Oregon, as we'll discuss in a moment, that happened there in Eugene. And so despite the fact that the exclusion laws were repealed, there was still kind of this overwhelming sentiment that Blacks were still not welcome or desired to be in the state and in the region. And it has continued over the years.
Yeah, one of our viewers had more of a comment than a question, but he commented that he found it interesting that Sacagawea is often cited and widely known as a member of the Lewis and Clark traveling party, but very few, if any, of the members of the Black folks coming across there known. And he just wanted to highlight that, I think, as an example of how the Black experience has been excluded from this history, starting way back in that era.
Yeah, especially, and thank you for making that observation, but especially considering that York was a very needed member of the expedition, but his status as, the companion or slave of Clark, kind of diminishes the role that he played, even though those within the expedition party recognized the contributions that he made were significant in the telling of the story. It's just Lewis and Clark. And then, oh, by the way, Sacagawea as well, and so it is kind of an unfortunate thing, but this is why the Oregon Black Pioneers exist, is to try to make sure that these stories are told and included as a part of the overall narrative of the telling of the story. Even for myself, as a native Portlandian, someone who's born and raised here, I didn't know about that, and so it's unique, even for myself, as being a part of this organization, to find these stories that are very interesting and need to be told as a part of the fabric of the state.
Absolutely. I have another comment. Another viewer is intrigued by the photo of the person, I believe, in Umatilla County with the hat on in the northeast section of the state, and wondering what his occupation is. That a rancher or cowboy?
Yes. So a whole nother presentation is about Black cowboys. So this guy is George Fletcher, and he was a real deal cowboy. Okay, and he actually won a lot of, I don't know exactly, I want to use my words carefully, a lot of buckles as a cowboy in various rodeos at the Pendleton Roundup. However, because he was Black, he wasn't technically able to win. So even though he would perform the best or be in first place or have the fastest time, or however they determine who's the winner of any particular event, he couldn't necessarily be claimed the winner. All right, but the legend of who he was and the contributions he made were significant for those who were in the kind of that farming, rural kind of cowboy life. And there's actually a book that highlights it. If I'm not mistaken, it's called Red, White, and Brown. And it kind of tells his story. And if anybody's interested in reading more about it, you can. I wish I had a couple of my books with me, but you can read more about the story of George Fletcher, and all of the things that he kind of did. And truthfully, that there were a large number of what we would describe as Black cowboys. But unfortunately, their stories just are never told, and it's always kind of viewed through the lens of, the white cowboy, if you will. Yeah. But for the most part, it was the Black, not stage hands, but the Black kind of ranchers who did a lot of that domestic work. They were really the ones who would tend the animals, do the gardening, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were pretty much instrumental in kind of teaching a lot of the white settlers who were traveling west, or whoever wanted to use kind of that Dust Bowl of Oklahoma when they really opened up that western frontier, to teach them even how to, manage the land and manage the herds and things of that nature.
That's great.
It's a very interesting story.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm sure there'd be a lot of people in our community that would love to read about Black cowboys. That sounds like an interesting topic. In that time period, is that 1911? Is that what that is?
1911, I think, is kind of when this photo was taken. But I want to say that the red, white, and brown book, it tells a story of George Fletcher, and then there's a like a Native American cowboy, which is kind of the representative of the red in the story. And then there's a white cowboy as well. And so it kind of tells the story about how they all kind of met up at the kind of Pendleton Roundup in this area to do this work, but how George Fletcher kind of outshined them all. Like everybody had their skills, but George Fletcher was like the man, you know? And so it kind of led to this kind of mythic story about him. And if I'm not mistaken, at the Pendleton Roundup, there is information and kind of a story specific to him, in addition to that book being written. And so, you know, one thing that I will say is that progressive people are trying to make sure that these stories are not forgotten and that these individuals are highlighted. And so I mentioned the Cora Cox story. The house is still up. And then I'm gonna tell a story in just a moment about the Mims family there in Eugene, and how there's a plaque and a house that's still remaining for the contributions that they made that we'll talk about in just a moment. There's even a statue of Yorick here in Portland at Selwood Park, if I'm not mistaken. The photo that I used is in Missouri, but we recently placed a bust of Yorick at Selwood Park within the last year. And when I say we, not Oregon Black Pioneers, but we as the state of Oregon, recognizing his contribution to the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Great. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like those are all the comments for now. Yeah, this is super interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, feel free
Well,
to.
I'm glad that people are chiming in.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
I just have my final portion of the presentation to talk specifically about kind of the Lane County region or the area where your watershed council is.
Yeah, I know folks are looking forward to that.
Okay. So, you know, kind of as I mentioned, despite the fact that there were these exclusion laws and some of these barriers within the state of Oregon, you know, Blacks kind of touched every corner of the state, and they made significant contributions, whether it be as ranchers, as we mentioned just a moment ago, as George Fletcher, land grant donations, as we talked about in the Cora Cox story, setting legal precedents, as the Holmes family did, business owners, you know, et cetera, entrepreneurs. They made considerable contributions to the state. However, there was always a consistent theme wherever they showed up, and ever increasing desire for them to not be there. And so that kind of leads me to the question that was asked in our last portion about, you know, how the exclusion laws kind of affected the Black population in the state of Oregon. And as I mentioned, despite the fact that the exclusion laws were repealed, the resentment still kind of remained. So this is a photo taken in 1921 in the Eugene area. I believe now it would be East Street. But this is highlighting Skinner Butte with the large KKK there representing the Ku Klux Klan and the cross, which is kind of their logo, if you will, in addition to the Triple K. And so at the turn of the century, the early 1900s, during Reconstruction, freed Black slaves in all parts of the United States were having great success as it pertains to their skills, their entrepreneurialism, their ability to work the land, because they had been kind of the domestic slaves for so long. They just kind of knew what to do and how to survive and how to, you know, make business and have a lot of great success. That led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And the rise of the Ku Klux Klan were, for lack of a better phrase, just kind of like the frustration of some of the whites who were just not having the success that Blacks were having, or wanted to blame Blacks for the lack of success that they were not having. And that included even the state of Oregon. And specifically, They had a foothold in Eugene, Portland, and Klamath Falls. And so they would advertise and ask people to join their organization. And some people felt that, oh, well, you know, these are just some individuals who have nothing better to do and should probably make better use of their time. The fact of the matter was, this was a serious organization within their mind, a serious mission, which was kind of to preserve white supremacy throughout all parts of the United States of America, which includes the new, well, at this time in the 1920s, the state of Oregon. So the migration throughout the state of Oregon led Blacks to many places seeking homestead and work. Although many Blacks headed to Portland for the rail yards in the early 1900s, many others found themselves in the Willamette Valley. No matter where in Oregon they went, they faced similar experiences: exclusion, racism, bias, and the Klan. Most people would not consider the Klan and their influence when considering the plight of Blacks in Lane County and specifically Eugene. But the Klan had considerable influence at this time in the state of Oregon. Because of its exclusion laws, there was still a sense that Blacks did not belong in the area. And that sentiment allowed the Klan to gain a foothold and to infiltrate institutions of government and within the local college. The photograph I used earlier was taken in 1921 and highlights the presence of the Ku Klux Klan in the Eugene area. The arrival of the Ku Klux Klan initially was more of a source of ridicule than concern to the local newspaper, the Morning Register. On August 7, 1921, it mocked the group by saying, "There is a reasonable sprinkling of citizens who are pleasantly intrigued by the prospect of getting out in their nightshirts with their heads swathed in pillow slips with holes burned in them, and capering throughout the dewy night in pursuance of some ghostly ritual or other. If that is as far as the Klan proposes to go, we see no reason to get excited." As that newspaper article highlights, many people did not take the Ku Klux Klan seriously, but the Klan was very serious in their mission to try to uphold white supremacy. The museum catalog contends the KKK proposed much more and quickly became a powerful force in both county and state politics. In fact, some of the area's most prominent citizens became members of the Klan, the museum narrator says, including the head of the Latin department at the University of Oregon, a leading local hazelnut grower who was the local commander of the American Legion, and the head of Eugene Fruit Growers Association, the vice president of the Eugene Chamber of Commerce, and the rector of the Episcopal Church. So as you can see, the Ku Klux Klan was made up of some of the highest leading officials in the city of Eugene, some of the most powerful individuals in Lane County. Because of the difficulties of the life of African Americans in Lane County, by the time the exclusion law was struck down, few Black families lived there. According to Lane County Historical Museum research, early residents remember a family surnamed Stone who lived behind the residence of the Eugene banker and merchant Charles Laurel on property owned by him in the 1880s or 1890s. But by 1929, there were only 5 African Americans recorded as living in Eugene. This is according to the Eugene Registered Guard. The Lane County Board of Commissioners organized staff to work with the NAACP of Eugene, Springfield, Oregon Unit 1119 and the City of Eugene government to design and create a memorial that will be placed in Alton Baker Park where Ferry Street Village once stood. So this last story that I'm going to tell is about a community called the Ferry Street Village. It was made up of Blacks who were excluded from living in the, at that time, city of Eugene and an unincorporated part of Lane County. This picture that I have here is taken in 1950, which happened right after this bridge was built. So if you can see my kind of cursor here, highlighting this black line, this is the Ferry Street Bridge. And then this is the Columbia River, if I'm not mistaken, or the Willamette. I believe it's the Willamette. And over here is where the Ferry Street Village was comprised. So the Lane County Board of Commissioners, along with the Eugene Springfield branch of the NAACP, created a monument to talk about this group of people and the Mims family, which I'm going to tell you about right now. During and immediately following the Great Depression, African Americans began coming to Lane County as the Southern Pacific Railroad expanded into the area, providing jobs. But discrimination by the white population made their lives difficult. Few could find houses to rent or buy, and most ended up in tent towns. Frame houses with canvas roofs and no running water or sewer on the banks of the Willamette River. So this is the Willamette River, and they were kind of forced to this area over here. They couldn't live in the city where the whites were because they wouldn't rent to them or allow them to buy property. So they kind of made their own community on the opposite side of the Willamette River. The ill treatment continued into 1950 when the county built the new Ferry Street Bridge, forcing the Black community to abandon their tent community, and in some cases without being able to gather up all their belongings. They regrouped in an area further out along what is now West 11th Avenue. The museum records note that the situation there was so poor that it drew criticism from the Portland Urban League, which called the Eugene situation disgraceful and horrible. St. Mark's Christian Episcopal Church, which became the center of the new Black community, still exists there, and at least one street, Sam Reynolds Street, honors one of the community's largest and longstanding African-American families. Although Oregon may not view itself as a segregationist culture, African-American performers and visitors, including artists such as Ella Fitzgerald, Marian Anderson, also experienced discrimination in Lane County, the history reports. Because they were not allowed to stay in any local hotels, local Black families welcomed the visitors into their homes. Even today, many Black people still find this area a difficult place to live and quickly move on to cities they find more opening and welcoming, the narrative concludes. The unfortunate legacies of Oregon's early exclusion law are still with us. So I made mention earlier about the Mims and how they had a home that they were able to purchase because they had some sympathetic white friends that purchased a piece of property in their name and gave that property to the Mims. The Mims ultimately were kind of a house of refuge for traveling African-American actors and athletes. As I mentioned earlier, Ella Fitzgerald, some collegiate and professional athletes, and Louis Armstrong all stayed at the Mims homes. I don't know if some of you are familiar with the Green Book, but the Green Book was kind of like a catalog, if you will, that highlighted places that Blacks could stay in the United States throughout the South, Midwest, and even the West. The Mims house did not officially make it into the Green Book, but it was known as a safe space and house of refuge for traveling African Americans through the state of Oregon. The destruction of the village had a lasting effect on the Black population in the city of Eugene. However, there is one remaining story of note that Lane County has worked to recognize and make a memorial for. That's the Mims house. The Mims were a couple who acquired a home in 1948 on High Street because someone had sympathy for them and the plight of the Blacks in the region. They purchased the house for the Mims after their removal from the Ferry village. Because Eugene and Lane County as a whole was not very accepting to Blacks in the area, the Mims house became a safe haven for Black travelers and celebrities. Names such as Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Nat King Cole, and even some collegiate and professional athletes stayed in the Mims house. It has been recognized as a historical site and now houses the NAACP Eugene chapter there. So as I mentioned, the Mims house is still standing, and it has this commemorative plaque that was done by the Lane County. Hold on, I want to get this right. I don't want to. The Lane County Board of Commissioners, in conjunction with the NAACP Eugene Springfield chapter, they arranged this plaque to commemorate the Mims house within the last 2 years. It was just before the pandemic that the plaque went up, and this was listed as a historical site. And so if you Google the story now, you can still find the Eugene Registered Guards commentary on the plaque and the story. And if you want to visit, it's on 330 High Street. This concludes my presentation. Again, I want to thank the Tonglong Watershed Council, Rob and Clinton, and everybody that's just been kind of listening in and participating with this story. Again, the purpose of me highlighting the contributions of early Oregon Black pioneers is not solely just to say that this is Black history, but to say that this is Oregon history and that all Oregonians should be familiar with it. To Rob's question earlier about the prolonged impact of the exclusion laws, there are still underlying effects of those exclusion laws. And what we have to do now that we're aware is make the necessary changes in order to make this state welcoming and desirable for all of its citizens. Sometimes that just simply means acknowledging some of the things that happened in the past and then trying to create new perspectives as to what we can do to ensure that these things do not continue in the future. So if you're interested in learning more, you can visit the Oregon Black Pioneers website. You can make a donation because we're currently working to develop a virtual museum that highlights many of the stories that I listed here today, but there's so many other stories that you can find out and learn about that are very interesting. I didn't even get into the Letitia Carson story, which is similar to the Holmes family story. Another young girl who traveled along the Oregon Trail, made it to Oregon, got her freedom, got some property, had the property taken away from her, sued, won the property, and then made a considerable contribution by donating some of her property to the state of Oregon. So there's so many great stories that need to be talked about.
Thank you, Troy. Thanks so much for sharing all those stories. You know, I was thinking while you were talking and leading up to this, just how much of this history and information has been left out or purposefully omitted from education. And kudos to you and Oregon Black Pioneers for what you're doing. This is such important work. I'd like to add that the Oregon Black Pioneers website is amazing. I've been on there and they have an entire curated online exhibit dedicated just to Eugene history. So I'd encourage folks to check that out. It's got a ton of information in it. You know, the image of the Skinner Butte with the KKK sign is chilling. And I think a lot of us, there's a difference between reading or hearing about something and seeing it visually and making that connection to your mind about, wow, that happened here. So that just, I think, again, renders the importance of what all you were doing and getting those photographs and historical documents and images out there for the public. And then sharing stories like the Mims, which are great, and that we see their resilience and then their amazing hospitality with housing musicians and famous people because they had nowhere else to go. I think I read on your website there were only 6 or 7 hotels in the entire state that people of color could rent a room for the night, which is just incredible and sad at the same time.
Yeah, no, it is kind of crazy. Like I was, when I was doing my research, I was trying to see if in fact they were listed in the Green Book. And you can still find, I believe the Green Book was published from about the late 30s until maybe the early 60s. And so every year there was like a new manual describing places that you can go and places that you can stay. And to your point, the last publication, in I believe either 63 or 73, there were 3 listed hotels throughout the whole state, you know. And so to your point, there was a lot of home sharing and a lot of families that were opening up their doors to any sort of travelers, you know, that were here. And as I mentioned also, the railway, it brought a lot of Blacks to the state, and so you got to consider all of those Blacks that are working on the railroads, whether they were traveling throughout or landed here ultimately, had to sleep at somebody's house,
Right.
because they couldn't always find a place to rent for themselves, and to your question earlier, that just really made it difficult for people to kind of settle here and build a family and a life and grab a foothold. So we have to tell those stories, so that we can really be truthful and honest about what we need to do moving forward, so that we can make this place equitable for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, and thinking again about education I received and many of my peers received, and so much of the history of Black folks across the country has left out. Do you know of any efforts going on in the state of Oregon or elsewhere that are trying to bring this information into public school curriculums?
Yes. So the Oregon Black Pioneers is currently working a pilot program to try to find a way in order to introduce this sort of history into, at minimum, like Portland Public Schools, and then try to use that as a pilot model for curriculum across the state. I think there's kind of a lot of resistance politically to this type of education. To your point, it's uncomfortable for people, and sometimes we don't want to know the real truth about our country or specific to our state or specific to our city. And so there are lots of efforts to try to tell the entire story about the history of our nation. But there are those that are working to try to prevent that from happening. It doesn't seem that way here in the state of Oregon. We'd like to consider ourselves a pretty progressive state in that regard. And so there isn't a lot of pushback to the overarching theme of critical race theory. But the fact of the matter is, we have to try to interject the story into the narrative so that we can even talk about it in such a manner that it's like, hey, these stories are necessary to be told, if that kind of makes sense. And so what we're trying to do right now is like get a survey of teachers to say, hey, there's some information that we want you to include in your telling of the state of Oregon's history. How can we kind of do that? Here's some stories that we have readily available. How can we help you to fit that into the telling of the state's history? And once we kind of get through that and maybe see if it's successful or how it kind of works, then I think we can do something on a much larger scale. But right now, we're just trying to interject this into at least a few classrooms as we can, and kind of use that as a springboard and start from there.
Yeah, hopefully it takes root and continues to grow.
Yeah, there seems to be, a legitimate interest of people when they hear this, like, man, I had no idea that happened. How can I find out more? That seems to be the response that we're getting. And so at least I feel like people are receptive to kind of hearing some of these stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's incumbent upon all of us as humans and citizens of this state and this country to continue being lifelong learners, even if we didn't get that education as kids. Like, there's opportunities to learn through organizations like yours who have done such an awesome job of curating so much information. And now that people are armed with this information and know how to get it, and know opportunities of where they can learn more, what is something that they can then do with that information?
Well, don't be afraid to talk about it. That's kind of first. If you found something interesting in the presentation today, tell someone else. And then just try to do more to learn more. And one thing that I like to say is to not limit, Black history to February, but it's a part of, our national history, our state history, our local history. And so be willing to hear things throughout the year. Don't limit yourself to just kind of othering the history, if you will, by saying it's only specific to this time and kind of creating barriers to say, well, now that we're outside of that designated time, we can't talk about it anymore. So be willing to talk about it at all times, and recognize that just because you did not know that story or that history was there that it's somehow retelling of history, but rather it's like a more broader perspective of the entire history. And so recognizing that it's just as important as hearing about Lewis and Clark's expedition to the new Oregon Territory, that they had a Black guy as a part of the expedition, and that Black settlers came and made significant contributions to the fabric of the state, and have a considerable contribution to the state history. And we should be desirous to learn more about that. So don't feel like it's someone else's story. This is a part of your story too, if you're an Oregonian as well. And be ready to hear it and be desirous to, find it. It's there. It's not as hard as you may think it is to find it. It just takes a little bit of time, energy, and effort to find it.
Great point. Well said. Before we close and wrap up, Clinton, did you notice any other questions come in, or did you have any you wanted to ask?
No, just to extend gratitude for your time here and for showing us a lot of different angles to Black history in Oregon. And I think a lot of times when we have conversations, it seems, wow, Eugene just seems so white. And what that tells me is that people don't see the contributions and don't see the people who are still here making those contributions. And so I think you taking the time and being willing to come and talk about the history of those and contributions and give us some insight into ongoing contributions is great, because it is about seeing what's here and what's been here for a long time. So I'm just really grateful.
Right. Well, thank you guys for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it. And hopefully we can do some more work in the future together.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back. And just want to echo what you said about the history of Black people and their contributions in Oregon being part of the entire story of the state, and this watershed is part of that story. And as an organization working to improve the watershed, we need to value and lean into the experiences and histories of all perspectives and all folks. And that's a major reason why we invited you on and wanted to have people hear this history. And it's important for folks to continue learning. And we can't have a successful future watershed without all voices helping us co-lead these conversations about what to do next. So thanks again, Troy. Really appreciate your time and expertise, and
you're welcome.
Amazing knowledge of history. So just to wrap up real quick, stay tuned to our website for our next public meeting. We're going to have a couple coming up this summer. There will be a series of 2 presentations centered on climate change and the impacts on the forestry community. They'll be presented in cooperation with Oregon State University, and they are happening on Tuesday, July 27th and Tuesday, August 10th. And those will also be live streamed like this. So thanks again to everybody for tuning in, and thank you, Troy. Really appreciate it. Have a good evening.
No problem. Thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you, Troy.
Thanks. Bye.